Picture the British Empire the way most people picture it. Red on the map, stretching across every continent on Earth. Kings and queens, the Royal Navy ruling the waves, Big Ben, tea, cricket, and the phrase people still repeat without thinking too hard about it, the empire on which the sun never set. By 1922, that phrase wasn't an exaggeration. The British Empire controlled roughly 458 million people and around 33.7 million square kilometers of territory, close to a quarter of the entire human population and a quarter of all the land on Earth. That's the story most of us grew up with. Power, order, progress, civilization exported to the world. But that version leaves something out. Something big. Here's the problem. The story looks very different depending on which side of the empire you are standing on. And once you start asking what it actually took to hold a quarter of the planet under one flag, the picture stops looking like glory and starts looking like something much harder to sit with. From London, the empire looked like destiny. From Bengal, from the Cape Colony, from Amritsar, it looked like something else entirely. Let's start with the palace view. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, British officials described their empire using words like duty, civilization, and progress. The idea, publicly at least, was that Britain was bringing railways, courts, and modern administration to backward parts of the world. Rudyard Kipling gave it a name in 1899. The white man's burden, a phrase that framed conquest as a moral obligation rather than a land grab. From the street, it looked different. In Bengal, in South Africa, in Ireland, in Kenya, the empire didn't arrive as a gift. It arrived as taxation, as famine policy, as martial law, as prison camps. The same decision that read as administration in a London ledger could mean starvation in a village 3,000 miles away. Take a single event and look at it from both directions. In 1943, as the Second World War raged, the British administration in India faced a food shortage in the province of Bengal. From London and from the colonial government's perspective, this was a wartime logistics problem. Grain needed to go to soldiers, to Ceylon, to other parts of the war effort, and difficult decisions had to be made under pressure. From the streets of Calcutta, it looked like something closer to abandonment. Rice prices spiked. Food that existed in the region was not reaching the people who needed it. People collapsed in the streets of a city that was, at the same time, still exporting grain elsewhere in the empire's wartime network. Historians still argue over exactly how many people died. The Whitehead Commission, the official inquiry set up afterward, estimated around 1.5 million deaths. The economist Amartya Sen, who lived through the famine as a child, argued the real number was closer to 3 million. Other estimates range as high as 3.8 million. What almost every serious historian agrees on is this: the famine wasn't primarily caused by a lack of food in the region. It was caused by failures of distribution, price control, and government priority, decisions made by people who were never at risk of starving themselves. Which version of that story is the real one? The wartime logistics problem, or the famine created by policy? Both were true at the same time, for different people. Let's actually put this into numbers, because this is where the scale becomes difficult to ignore. At its territorial peak around 1920, the British Empire held roughly 412 to 458 million people under some form of British authority, depending on which year you use. Somewhere between 23 and 25% of every human being alive on Earth at that moment. To put that in perspective, that's not one country dominating a region. That's one government, headquartered on an island smaller than the state of Kansas, holding formal or informal authority over roughly 1 in every 4 people on the planet. British India alone, what's now India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, accounted for the overwhelming majority of that population, somewhere in the range of 300 million people by the early 20th century. That's more people living under a single colonial administration than lived in the rest of the empire's territories combined, several times over. Now put a smaller number next to that massive one. During the Second Boer War in South Africa, between 1899 and 1902, the British operated camps that interned roughly 154,000 Boer civilians and tens of thousands of black Africans. Estimates of the dead vary. Historians generally place Boer civilian deaths somewhere between 18,000 and 28,000, and separate estimates for black African deaths in a parallel camp system range from around 14,000 to 20,000. In the Boer camps specifically, roughly 80% of the dead were children under 16. Compare that to combat deaths in the same war, around 7,000 Boer fighters killed in actual battle. In other words, in a war remembered mostly for its military campaigns, more civilians died behind barbed wire from disease and malnutrition than soldiers died fighting. The camps killed more people than the war did. This is the first thing to understand about the British Empire. The story isn't really about conquest as an event, a battle won, a flag raised, a treaty signed. It's about administration as a system that had to be maintained, year after year, across a quarter of the human race, and the machinery required to maintain that system generated a level of human cost that rarely made it into the official record. The crown was the symbol of the empire. The system underneath it, the taxation, the police powers, the camps, the famine policies, was the actual empire. And that system is the real story. If the official story explains the surface, civilization, trade, progress, then the political reality explains what was actually happening underneath it. Colonial administration wasn't a single unified project. It was a patchwork of governors, companies, and local arrangements, each optimized to extract maximum value at minimum cost to London. The British East India Company, a private trading corporation, governed most of India for over 2 centuries before the British government formally took direct control in 1858. Meaning a huge portion of the empire was, for generations, run for shareholder profit rather than national policy at all. If political control explains who held power, the economic engine explains why anyone wanted it. Colonies were valuable because they produced raw materials cheaply and bought British manufactured goods in return. A closed economic loop that historians call mercantilism. India exported cotton, indigo, tea, and opium. Britain, in turn, used India as a captive market for its own textiles, undercutting local Indian weavers who had produced world-class cloth for centuries. By the mid-19th century, colonial tax policy and trade rules had devastated India's own textile industry in favor of factories back in Manchester. The clearest single symbol of this arrangement is the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where the East India Company's forces, under Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal largely through bribery and defection rather than raw military superiority. Several of the Nawab's own commanders had been paid to withhold their troops from the fight. That single battle handed the company effective control over Bengal, one of the wealthiest and most populous regions in the world at the time, and set the template for how much of the rest of India would eventually be absorbed, not always through open war, but through a mix of force, debt, and manufactured local alliances. Perhaps nowhere is the economic engine of empire more disturbing than the Opium Wars. By the 1830s, Britain had a massive trade imbalance with China. The British wanted tea, silk, and porcelain, but China wanted very little that Britain produced. The solution the East India Company settled on was opium, grown in British India and smuggled into China in enormous quantities, creating widespread addiction. When the Chinese government tried to seize and destroy opium stockpiles in 1839, Britain went to war to protect the drug trade, and won, forcing China to open its ports and cede Hong Kong under the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. Britain fought and won a war specifically to preserve its right to sell a narcotic to another country's population. If the economic engine explains the money, the human cost explains what that money was built on. This is where names and dates matter most. On April 13, 1919, in the walled garden of Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer ordered 50 British and Gurkha soldiers to open fire without warning on a crowd of unarmed men, women, and children who had gathered for a religious festival and a political protest. Dyer later testified he intended the massacre to have a moral effect, to terrorize the population into submission. He was removed from his command, but the House of Lords in Britain praised him, and supporters raised a large fund in his honor. Amritsar wasn't an isolated case, and it wasn't even the first time a British-administered famine or crackdown had produced numbers on this scale. Decades earlier, between 1845 and roughly 1852, Ireland, governed directly from London as part of the United Kingdom, not as a distant colony, suffered a famine after a potato blight destroyed the crop that nearly half the population depended on for food. Around 1 million people died from starvation and related disease, and roughly 2 million more immigrated, mostly to North America. Ireland's population fell from close to 8.4 million before the famine to about 6.6 million after it, and it would not recover those numbers for well over a century. What makes the Irish famine a genuinely dark chapter, rather than simply a natural disaster, is the response. Throughout the blight years, Ireland continued exporting grain, meat, and dairy to Britain, because much of that food was grown on land controlled by landlords, who had no obligation to feed their tenants first. The government of the day, led by Prime Minister Robert Peel, and later Lord John Russell, largely followed a policy of leaving relief to the free market and local landlords rather than direct food distribution, on the theory that government intervention would distort prices and discourage private enterprise. Historians still debate how much of the death toll should be attributed to the blight itself versus to that policy choice. But the fact that food kept leaving a starving country by ship is not in dispute. The long-term consequence of moments like Amritsar is that they didn't stay contained. Mahatma Gandhi, who had previously supported the British war effort in hopes of gradual reform, said the massacre changed his mind completely. He moved from seeking partial autonomy to demanding full independence. A single afternoon of violence in one walled garden helped accelerate the end of British rule over the largest population any empire had ever governed. But this is where the story becomes much more complicated, because Amritsar and the Bengal famine were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a system, and that system generated costs that piled up in ways that rarely made headlines at the time. First, there was the deliberate deindustrialization of local economies, like the collapse of Indian textile production under British trade policy, which pushed millions of skilled artisans into poverty. Second, there was the use of forced or indentured labor. After Britain abolished slavery within its empire in 1833, itself a landmark reform, colonial administrators still needed cheap labor for plantations, so they developed an indenture system that shipped over 1 million laborers from India to places like Mauritius, Fiji, Trinidad, and Guyana under contracts that, in practice, often resembled the system they had just replaced. Third, there was the recurring pattern of famine under colonial administration. Bengal in 1943 wasn't unique. India experienced a series of major famines under British rule throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and historians continue to debate how much of the death toll traces back to policy choices rather than genuine scarcity. Fourth, there was the psychological and legal architecture of control. Laws, like the Rowlatt Act of 1919, passed just before Amritsar, which allowed authorities to imprison people without trial. Systems of control don't just kill people directly. They reshape what ordinary life is allowed to look like for generations. And finally, there was the erasure of records. Colonial administrations often kept incomplete data on the populations they governed, especially non-white populations, which is part of why, more than a century later, historians are still arguing over how many people actually died in the Boer War Camps or in the Bengal Famine, because the empire that caused these events didn't always think the victims were worth counting precisely. The empire could expand and sustain itself because so many of these costs were being paid somewhere else, in villages, in camps, in famine zones far from the parliament buildings making the decisions. And if you think Amritsar was the turning point, what came just before it in the same era was arguably more consequential in raw numbers. Return to the Boer War Camps between 1899 and 1902. What began as a strategy to house displaced Boer families and separate guerrilla fighters from their support networks turned, largely through poor planning rather than an explicit intention to kill, into one of the deadliest civilian internment systems of its era. Overcrowding, contaminated water, and inadequate food led to epidemics of typhoid and measles that swept through the camps. A British social reformer, Emily Hobhouse, visited the camps in 1901 and published a report on the conditions she witnessed. Her findings caused a political uproar in Britain itself. The Liberal opposition leader, Henry Campbell Bannerman, stood up in Parliament and asked when a war stops being a war and becomes, in his words, a policy of barbarism. The government of the day survived the vote, but the public pressure it generated forced improvements to camp conditions before the war ended. The event people remember from the Boer War is the fighting, the sieges, the guerrilla campaigns, the famous names. The real story was the number of children who died behind barbed wire, while the fighting was still happening a few miles away. So if a system like this had worked for centuries, why did it begin to change? The honest answer is that it didn't change because empire suddenly became unprofitable or the British public suddenly turned against it overnight. It changed piece by piece, driven by a combination of economic exhaustion, moral pressure at home, and organized resistance abroad. 2 world wars drained Britain's treasury and military capacity in ways that made holding a global empire increasingly unaffordable. India alone had contributed well over 1 million soldiers to the British war effort in the First World War, and more than 2 million in the Second, and colonial leaders increasingly asked why populations who had fought and died for the empire were still denied self-rule. At the same time, movements led by figures like Gandhi in India, and later independence leaders across Africa and the Caribbean, organized sustained, often nonviolent, political pressure that made continued colonial administration harder and more expensive to maintain by force. India and Pakistan gained independence in 1947. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957. Over the following 2 decades, dozens of former colonies followed. The empire that had controlled a quarter of the planet in 1922 had shrunk to a small handful of overseas territories within about 50 years. The old world didn't disappear overnight. It was dismantled piece by piece, colony by colony, negotiation by negotiation, and sometimes revolt by revolt. Now compare the advantages the empire held against the strategies used by the people who eventually outlasted it. Britain's advantage was almost entirely structural. The Royal Navy controlled global sea lanes, giving Britain the ability to move troops, goods, and administrators to almost any coastline on Earth faster than most rivals. Its administrative systems, however exploitative, were genuinely sophisticated, allowing a relatively small number of British officials to run enormous colonial bureaucracies with the help of local intermediaries. Ordinary people and smaller powers survived and eventually pushed back through very different tools. In India, mass civil disobedience, refusing to buy British salt, refusing to cooperate with British courts, turned Britain's own administrative dependence on local cooperation into a weakness. In Kenya, the Mau Mau Uprising in the 1950s used guerrilla tactics in dense forest terrain that neutralized much of Britain's technological advantage. In Ireland, decades of political organizing alongside armed resistance eventually forced a level of independence that outright rebellion alone hadn't achieved in earlier centuries. Power doesn't always belong to the side with the biggest army. Sometimes it belongs to the side that can outlast the other one. The Mau Mau Uprising deserves a closer look, because it shows how the empire's playbook barely changed even as it entered its final years. Between 1952 and 1960, in the British colony of Kenya, the Kikuyu-led Mau Mau movement fought a guerrilla war rooted in grievances over land seized by white settlers and political exclusion under colonial rule. Britain's response was, once again, mass detention. Colonial authorities eventually held somewhere between 80,000 and 160,000 Kenyans in a network of roughly 50 to 60 camps, some of which later scholars have directly compared to gulags. During a single operation in Nairobi in 1954, known as Operation Andal, tens of thousands of residents were forced from their homes in a matter of weeks and screened as suspected rebels. Conditions in the camps involved forced labor, malnutrition, and documented torture. At the most notorious site, Ola Camp, 11 detainees were beaten to death by camp guards in 1959 in an incident the colonial government first tried to blame on contaminated water. A later Kenyan human rights inquiry alleged that as many as 90,000 people were killed, tortured, or maimed during the crackdown. In 2013, after a lengthy legal battle, the British government formally acknowledged the abuses and agreed to pay compensation to thousands of elderly Kenyan survivors. One of the first times Britain admitted, in a court of law, that specific colonial-era torture had actually happened. The pattern should sound familiar by now. Wherever the empire faced sustained resistance in its final decades, the response defaulted to the same tools it had used in South Africa half a century earlier and in India before that: mass internment, forced labor, and a public justification that framed brutal suppression as necessary order. One technology reshaped this entire equation more than any other: the telegraph, paired with steam-powered shipping. Before the mid-19th century, a message from London to India could take months. By the 1870s, undersea telegraph cables allowed near-instant communication across the empire, and steamships cut travel time from months to weeks. This let London micromanage colonial administration in real time rather than granting local officials broad independent authority. The hidden consequence of that speed cut both ways. It let Britain respond faster to rebellions and crises, but it also meant that news of British abuses, like the Amritsar Massacre or the Boer War Camps, reached London newspapers and Parliament far faster than in earlier centuries, fueling political backlash at home almost as quickly as the events themselves occurred. Faster communication empowered the empire to control more territory more tightly, and simultaneously gave its critics faster ammunition to challenge it. Public and legal attitudes shifted alongside these pressures, though unevenly and slowly. Britain formally abolished slavery within most of its empire through the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, decades before the United States did the same, a genuine reform, driven by a sustained moral campaign inside Britain itself, though it's worth noting compensation under that act went to slave owners for their lost property, not to the enslaved people themselves. Nearly a century later, the same government that had banned slavery was still running indenture systems and suppressing colonial uprisings by force. The law changed first. The underlying practices of extraction and control took much longer to catch up. Resistance to empire didn't end when formal colonial rule did. In India, the independence movement's tactics of organized civil disobedience became a template studied and adapted by other movements around the world, including the American civil rights movement decades later. In Kenya, in South Africa, in the Caribbean, communities that had endured forced labor, land seizure, and violent suppression rebuilt political institutions, cultural identities, and economies largely from scratch after independence. The point of understanding this history isn't only to know what happened to people under empire. It's to understand what those same people did afterward, with what was left. Put three consequences of the British Empire together, and the connections to the present become hard to miss. First, many of today's most contested political borders, in the Middle East, in South Asia, in parts of Africa, were drawn by British administrators with limited local knowledge, often for administrative convenience rather than any regard for existing ethnic, religious, or tribal boundaries. Second, English remains a dominant global language today largely because of the reach of British colonial administration education systems, and trade networks. Third, wealth inequality between former colonial powers and former colonies remains a subject of active historical and economic research, with a growing body of scholarship examining how colonial-era extraction shaped long-term development gaps that persist today. The past didn't disappear when the empire wound down. It changed shape, and it's still visible in maps, languages, and economic statistics today. Consider the difference between the empire at its strongest and the moment its weaknesses became impossible to hide. At its peak around 1920, the empire looked, from the outside, like the most durable political structure in human history, controlling a quarter of the Earth's people and land, backed by the world's most powerful navy, and seemingly unshakable. But only a few pressures needed to align to expose how fragile that structure actually was underneath. Two catastrophically expensive world wars drained Britain's finances and manpower. Organized independence movements, from India to Africa to the Caribbean, made the cost of maintaining control through force increasingly unbearable, both financially and politically. And global public opinion, especially after the horrors of the Second World War, made ideas about racial hierarchy and forced subjugation far less acceptable on the world stage, turned decisively against colonial rule. That gap, between a power that looks permanent from a distance and a power that is already cracking from within, is the difference between an empire in 1920 and the same empire by 1950, unrecognizable in size within a single human lifetime. So here's the full picture, beginning to end. What looked like a story of kings, ships, and civilization exported around the world was actually a story about a system built to extract wealth and control from roughly a quarter of humanity, and the human cost required to sustain that system for as long as it lasted. The famine in Bengal, the camps in South Africa, the massacre in Amritsar, the opium forced onto China, and the labor extracted across 100 colonies weren't exceptions to how the empire worked. They were how the empire worked. The crown survived in Britain long after the empire it once ruled was gone. But the world underneath that crown changed completely, and it's still changing today, in borders, in languages, and in the long economic aftershocks of a system that once decided the fate of 1 in every 4 people alive on Earth. History remembers the flags raised. It's slower to remember the bill that came due, and who actually ended up paying it. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to Gunovate for more hidden history, forgotten stories, and the darker side of the events that shaped our world.